Welcome everyone to our public interview / workshop with Quentin Findlay, who has flown all the way from Christchurch, New Zealand. My name is Michael, and I'll be chairing the event and asking questions. After how long, Ryan? Before we turn to Q&A?
Oh, as long as you want.
Okay. After about 20 and 30 minutes, we'll turn to kind of an audience Q&A. So feel free to percolate during that time. Quentin has been employed by the National Union of Public Employees as a full-time union organiser since 2013, having previously been employed by the Department of Courts, Parliament, NZEI, and the Lincoln University Students Association. He has a PhD in political economy, specialising in the early history of the New Zealand Labour Party from Lincoln University. He has lectured in politics at the University of Otago and Lincoln University. He also tutors in politics, history, and political economy at the Canterbury Workers' Educational Association. And he's also a member of the Canterbury Socialist Society. So today's talk will be about the Alliance, past and present. The Alliance existed in the 1990s to 2000s as a coalition effort between a number of progressive parties in New Zealand. With that, I will turn it over to Quentin just for some basic framing so we can kind of learn a bit more. So first of all, Quentin, because there's kind of going to be a bit of a double barrier for some of our audience in that, on the one hand, the majority of our audience is younger, so I'm going to be the vessel onto which that you'll all be projecting today as someone who is of a generation who was not yet politically conscious. I remember the Alliance, but I was a child, basically a child teenager. And then there's the other factor that since mostly everyone here is from Australia, not from New Zealand, you might be lacking some familiarity about that as well. So we'll set things up basically with some really basic who, what, when, where, why kind of questions to try and kick things off. So the first thing I just wanted to find out about, Quentin, is kind of what your background was on the left, like personally, and what your first encounters with the organised left were.
Kia I shouldn't really say that. Can you hear me?
It's not going through for some reason.
Okay, so let's try again. Speak.
Hello. That's much better. Kia I should really say that as a New Zealander. But look, it's so good to actually hear 40 years of my life, 45 years of my life condensed and so on, when I wrote that and so on like that. Basically I come from essentially good working class stock, one could actually say. My father was a railway labourer. I was born in the esteemed city of Christchurch in New Zealand, though I never lived in Christchurch till around about 20 years ago. I spent a lot of my time in Timaru and Ashburton and so on like that, and you're probably not familiar with the South Island, but essentially there are worse things and so on than living in Timaru and Ashburton, but I can't think of them. But basically went to Otago University after school. Before I went to Otago, I spent several years working at Watties as a process worker and forklift driver. And then I went to Otago. I've got my undergraduate degrees in politics and history. My master's is actually looking at basically the political whether or not the British Labour Party was actually post-Fordist and whether or not post-Fordism was actually a brand of socialism. The answer to that very simply is no. And then, of course, later on, about 20 years later, I decided, well, since I was working at Lincoln University, why not actually start a degree in science or do a PhD? So I ended up, of course, by basically doing a PhD looking at the early New Zealand Labour Party and its relationship with socialism, and did in fact socialism influence the New Zealand Labour Party's policy and directions? The answer to that also is no. So just in case you're wondering inside about that. In terms of what I've done, I first joined the New Zealand Labour Party. That was probably my first contact. My father was a member of the National Union of Railway Men. I don't think there were any railway women inside at the time, I'm not sure about that. But basically, with the NUR back in the 60s and 70s, and I had some contact through them because he was on the local executive of the NUR. But basically, I became politically aware in the aftermath of the Springbok tour in 1981. And for those of you who probably don't know New Zealand history, what happened was, at that time, South Africa was an apartheid state, and there was a lot of outrage when Sir Robert Muldoon, who was the Prime Minister at the time, the Tory Prime Minister, invited the Springbok rugby team to actually play in New Zealand. And what happened was a series of marches, protests, which got very, very violent throughout the country as people basically divvied down between supporting the tour and opposing the tour. My father and a lot of his mates from work actually supported the tour. I was opposed to the tour, and my first piece of political action was actually marching down Stafford Street in Timaru, opposed to the tour, where we were cursed, booed, got everything thrown at us. And in fact, Timaru was the only place where they called the tour off because they couldn't guarantee the potential of the Springbok. In fact, it was one of those places also where people were very fiercely pro-tour. After that, I joined the New Zealand Labour Party. At the time, the Labour Party was a social democratic party in the true sense of the word. Essentially, it believed, or rather post-war social democracy. It was led by a guy called Bill Rowling, and what they believed in was things like progressive taxes, full employment, free education, free healthcare, etc., etc., etc. And the Labour Party, of course, had stood for those things really since 1935. In 1984, the New Zealand Labour Party was elected into government. It was then headed by David Logie and another person called Roger Douglas. And then it went off on a completely different tangent, basically doing stuff that Margaret Thatcher actually admitted that she only wished that she could do. And essentially, as a result, Labour became very much a freewheeling, free market party. And I was president of Labour Youth in the late 1980s, which was quite an interesting time to be a member of the Labour Party, which was very quickly breaking down. And at that time too, I was also involved in what you could term the broad left in the Labour Party. Unlike the Australian Labour Party, the New Zealand Labour Party had no factions. I was told once that we were just one big happy family. Of course, it was complete bullshit, none of it was true. The fact is that, the Labour Party was actually in open civil war, and I can talk a bit about that and so on too. But the result of it was, that in the end, was that the left was basically pushed out of the Labour Party. And so Jim Anderton, who was the MP for Sydenham, and the only one in the caucus who was saying anything like we should really be following the party's manifesto and policies, formed his own party called the New Labour Party and contested Sydenham, which we won back. The Greens were also formed at this point. In 1992, we then went and formed an alliance with the Greens and Manamota Hake, which was a Maori nationalist party to the left that was headed by the former MP Matthew Rata. And the Democrats, who were right-wing social predators, but nonetheless were quite okay to put their names to a left-wing document, and form the Alliance. The Alliance existed all the way up to 2002. We had at one point 13 MPs, and essentially we were the only party in Parliament during that time to actually push what could stay a standard social democratic platform and policies. And I mean, we were successful to an extent in doing that. We certainly pushed Labor back to the left. At one point, the Alliance actually outpolled Labor, and it did do that because of the fact that the Labor Party wasn't actually basically supporting anything that was close to its original principles or policies and so on like that. So we had that success. In 1992, the Alliance broke apart, collapsed. Jim went and formed his own party again. And of course, the rest, they say, is history. The Alliance didn't exist again until really this year, when it was reinvigorated, mostly by Tom Round and the Socialists. and essentially they've put some time and effort into it. And basically, so we've come back again to offer, I think, a social democratic vision and viewpoint. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah, awesome. Well, where we can kind of jump into, I suppose, is the origins of the Alliance as emerging from Anderton's New Labour party. I was interested that Jim Anderton famously said that he didn't leave the Labour Party left him, which, curiously enough, Christopher Hitchens actually said the same thing about the left. And this prompts me to kind of consider what the basis is for a split in a party. This is traditionally how someone on the kind of Leninist left might think of, like an organised revolutionary party. But certainly there are underpinnings in social reality that make certain divergences in electoral campaigns as well occur. And I was just wondering what you think of what made New Labour take place in the first place. You mentioned that there was factionalism within the Labour Party. You touched briefly upon the fourth Labour government's introduction of neoliberal economic policy with Roger Douglas. So maybe you could expand on that for those who are less familiar, perhaps, if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I could do that. The Labour Party originally, as I said, was a social democratic party headed by Bill Rowling. That was certainly when I joined. That was at age 14. Under David Longy, essentially, and under Roger Douglas too, the party essentially just completely ignored all that and went down a new line of essentially advocacy of the free market. So, I mean, I'll talk about more about that tonight, but essentially it'd be fair to say that essentially the Labour Party in New Zealand essentially adopted wholesale neoliberalism, and did so not only in terms of what there are two papers, government management, economic management, but essentially it did it in a practical sense, it did it in a policy sense and so on as well. So what happened was that Labour, of course, originally had stood for, for example, full employment. The state was always seen as an active initiator and so on to create employment and so on like that through a regulatory system, i.e. Keynesianism and so on like that. The Labour Party essentially under Roger Douglas said we're not going to do that any longer. The free market will now basically determine how employment is actually done. Everything essentially has to measure up to free market ideals. And so that spread not only into the economy, where the Labour government deregulated wholesale, essentially a lot of the government sector, it sold it off, deregulated it, essentially made it compete. There was a joke at one point saying that if the government owned a fish and chip shop, it would compete it off into competing fish and chips. So I mean, essentially it was that sort of scenario. The result in the Labour Party itself, one can imagine, was the Labour Party had built itself up to a really mass party. It had anywhere between 80 to 100,000 members, which made it at that time in New Zealand one of the largest political parties that had been. The Labour Party just fell apart. And my first conference, which would have been the 1986 conference, was essentially there was an underlying anger towards the government and so on at that point by delegates, particularly when the government was seeking basically approval to, do various things like, for example, GST and so on like that, which was seen as being contrary to Labour policy. In 1987, the government won a mandate and so on, electorally, very large, but in terms of actual votes cast, very small, because we had first passed the post at this time, and we went to the conference in 87, and the conference just erupted into wholesale destruction, would be the best way of saying it, where cabinet ministers were booed. Essentially, people got up and essentially threw things at them. There were all sorts of things happening. In 1988, the situation just got worse, and I was there when Jim Anderton at that time stood for basically party president. I should add that the left had also formed what was known as the EPN, the Economic Policy Network, out of an organisation for the Labour Policy Network. Essentially, this was seen by the hierarchy of the party as basically a faction, and they were very eager to actually get rid of that. We had a conference basically in Dunedin, the Labour Party did, where Jim was put up as president. Again, as I said, it was without doubt basically the most tumultuous conference I've ever been in, where people again got, cabinet ministers just got booed. The party itself, there were actual fights at party meetings. Like I was at a party meeting where Helen Clark's electric secretary knocked out Richard Prebble's electric secretary. It was that sort of organisation and so on. So, if you wanted adventure, you came and joined the Labour Party. So after 88, it became very, very obvious that essentially we could not stay in the same party. And you have to remember that when the NLP and the left the Labour Party, several years later, Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble left the Labour Party, and they went and formed ACT, which of course is on the far right of the New Zealand political spectrum. And so you have to ask yourself what sort of party existed when in fact you could have two diametrically opposed parties coming out of it. And that was the state of the New Zealand Labour Party in the 1980s. And that was why Jim left. And so in the end, we basically formed the NLP because of the fact that we were committed to Labour Party principles. We were committed in science to a social democratic policy and provision. The Labour Party couldn't operate that or provide it to us, so we went out and formed our own party.
I want to ask two questions to contextualise this in the broader sense. One is more theoretical, I suppose, and the other is more about society. So the question, first of all, the first one has to do with what you were saying earlier about your research. Correct me if I'm wrong, was it your PhD where you were in the British Labour Party?
Yeah.
Yeah, about whether or not they were post-Fordist, and you answered that no. Could you expand on that a bit more?
Well, that was actually in relation to the British Labour Party.
Sorry, I just remember you talking.
Cool. So that I actually was very fascinated by the British Labour Party, and one of the reasons I was fascinated by the British Labour Party was because of the fact at the time it was seen as still being a social democratic party. This was under Kinnock and so on like that, and it had a definable left. Then, of course, Tony Blair, of course, became leader of the Labour Party and fundamentally changed it, or so we thought. You have to remember, of course, that we were watching this from thousands of miles away in New Zealand. And one of the things, of course, I became very much sort of enamoured, one could say, with the various posts that were happening at the time, post-Fordism, post-materialism, postmodernism, stuff like that makes me eat the carpet now. But at the time they were seen as being incredibly fascinating and interesting. And one of the things too was I was a reader of a magazine called Marxism Today. And for those of you who probably have not heard of it, but Marxism Today was a theoretical journal put out, of course, by the Communist Party of Great Britain. And essentially in the 1980s, it decided to become very racy, one could actually say, and essentially started talking about post-Fordism, post-Thatcherism, and developing what it termed as a post-Fordist, basically prescription for the future. Basically, it was also nearly run out of the Communist Party as a result of this. As you can imagine, the old hardline Stalinists were not very pleased, but particularly since, too, the Marxism Today editors got Tory ministers to actually write for them, and of course put big advertisements in their very glossy magazine. But it led me down the road to actually thinking about whether or not Labour was actually a post-Fordist party, mostly too because a number of the people who wrote for Marxism Today ended up in Tony Blair's sort of inner circle writing policies for him. So I basically sat down and over 3.5 years wrote a thesis looking at basically the Labour Party and Britain's development, and essentially then asking that, or trying to answer the question whether or not post-Fordism, whether or not the British Labour Party under Tony Blair was basically post-Fordist socialism? The answer to that is no.
That's interesting because I know that David Harvey writes about this idea of post-Fordism in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, which is a book that's familiar to some people in Platypus who've read it. And, I will not jump the gun because you'll be talking about neoliberalism on the panel later on today, but maybe we can weave this into some considerations of the broader socio-cultural dynamics that were at play in the 1970s and 1980s. Famously, you've got the snap election, which Roger Muldoon calls, and that's what brings about the fourth Labour government. And at the same time, you've got this is a progressive historiographical way to view this period, but people will often mention the anti-Springbok tour movement as being like a very galvanizing moment for kind of the late New Left, along with what had been, the anti-Vietnam War movement. At the same time, you've also got other examples like, this reaction to the fourth Labour government splits the Labour Party as well. So there are a number of things going on in the 1980s, and what I'm interested in is how you might compare that period with today, and what motivations might have existed for New Labour and then Alliance, as compared with contemporary motivations for the Alliance by yourself and your peers in that domain.
Well, I mean, in one sense, the 1980s were a very exciting time. When people talk about, there's always comparison and so on, because I'm a member of Generation X, and we essentially were cynical and so on like that. And basically, we've always felt like, for example, basically the boomers, essentially those people who came before me, of course, essentially lived in a time of, for example, full employment, high wages, all these other great things. They marched down the street against Vietnam and so on. But we had, of course, lucked out on that. And essentially, when I came along, of course, it was a time of rising unemployment. And the world seemed a lot darker than it did. You had to remember, too, that essentially we had what we saw as a completely insane president in the White House. Of course, Donald Trump makes Ronald Reagan look completely sane, and who was threatening to actually unleash at one point nuclear annihilation and so on like that upon the world. And
the anti-nuclear movement was something I forgot to mention in this time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you had that. So for us at the time, there were all these great big questions, and of course, as I said, the world seemed a lot darker. And New Zealand and the rest of the world, of course, were still going through quite a deep recession and so on at that time and so on as well. And a lot of the opposition, like in 1984, around the snap election, as someone said, it could be summed up in one word, and that word was Muldoon. Essentially, as someone said, you were either for Sir Robert Muldoon or you were against Sir Robert Muldoon. And when it came to the 1984 election, essentially that's how people tended to vote. In 1984, I think there was voting turnout was between, around about 90% or something like that. Like, it was a very high turnout for New Zealand voting. It's not compulsory in New Zealand. But there was also a right-wing party contesting that election called the New Zealand Party, which was a proto-ACT party headed by a very interesting person called Bob Jones, who was a property developer. And Bob Jones, of course, essentially was famous for making completely outrageous comments that were sexist, racist, misogynistic, and so on. You name it, Bob Jones said it.
Punching news anchors on the face on TV.
Pardon?
Punching news anchors on the face on TV.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, he did. And also, of course, essentially, basically coming out with essentially with a free market agenda, because he thought that Muldoon, of course, was, quote, too socialistic and ran the country like a Polish shipyard. And so essentially that was what motivated a lot of people. And plus, of course, the media basically sold the new right revolution that happened in 1984 as something new and exciting. Basically it was something that would benefit everyone, and that we had all been ripped off, or New Zealand had been pushed back by actually the old Keynesian state and so on like that, that in fact better times were on the way, we were told, in the long term, if in fact we adopted the free market. And so, there was one point there, I think they said that we'd soon be like, what was it, Switzerland, we'd be the Switzerland of the South Pacific. And, there are all these quotes about what was it, short-term pain for long-term gain. Well, it's been 40 years, I'm still waiting for the gain. So that was essentially, what was actually happening at the time. And when Douglas took in and he started the reforms, and basically the economy at that point, as I said again, I'm trying not to actually talk too much about this because of tonight, but essentially when inflation went up to one point, I think around about 10 or 15%, and interest rates shot up to about 20%, and unemployment went through the roof at one point, I think it hit something like 10 or 12%. It was very, very difficult to actually see that there was anything positive actually coming out of it.
Okay. Can I follow up on this? Because you're drawing out how there was this kind of new right revolution happening in New Zealand. In fact, that's the name of a famous book, isn't it? Revolution about the fourth Labour government. I mean, that's not the new right, but of course Roger Douglas would split and form ACT. And I'm thinking about the contrast, or you might say reflection to that, and what is happening in the progressive domain in New Zealand with the rise of, social credit had been around for a while, but you also get the Values Party, which emerges late 70s, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then by the early 90s, as you mentioned, you've got the Greens, who famously had the bumper sticker / slogan, neither left nor right, but forward. So there seemed to be a new kind of purchase on politics that was making sense to people, and I was just wondering how you think this might have folded into the rise of the need for a coalition between parties that was the alliance. And is coalition the right word, or is there kind of a different terminology?
It was an alliance.
Alliance, okay.
It was an electoral alliance originally. And I think that in the 1970s, towards the end, traditionally since World War II, both Labour and National have been mass-based parties. So they've got over 45% or 50% of the polls. And the last time, apart from 2020, that a New Zealand government actually achieved over 50% under first past the post was 1951. And since that time, essentially a number of voters voting for either National or Labour had declined considerably. But again, they still managed to rack up, usually on average, anywhere from 45 to 46, 37%. And social credit came along, I think, in about 1954. I think in its first outing, it got 7% or 11% or something like that. And when Values was developed or came along in 1972, I think it got 2%. But all the same, was seen as shaking up that traditional movement. Now, at the end of the 1970s, I think that there had been a lot of popular disenchantment with both Labour and National. And that was when they actually first started to drop below 40% in terms of popular support. And there was also a lot of popular disenchantment with first past the post. You guys have problems with preferential voting. I tell you, first past the post is it's completely, so we can actually have a party, and it did happen in both 1978 and 81, that polled less than the opposition, but won, because of the fact that it got more seats. And this led to, as I said, popular disenfranchisement and so on with those two parties, the feeling that neither of them were basically looking out for New Zealanders and so on like that. And this continued throughout the 1980s, and you saw it, of course, with basically the rise of the New Zealand Party. And then, as I said too, with the reforms of the fourth Labour government, basically there was a real push on then for the sake of saying, well, we never voted for this, we have no control over it, we want something different. And poll after poll after poll and political survey proved that New Zealanders at that time were completely alienated and disenchanted with both. and essentially with the Labour Party, a party that was seen at the time as not listening to anyone, but essentially pushing their own agenda. So when it came to 1990, with the NLP and the Greens, the NLP got 5%, the Greens got 6%, if I remember correctly. But basically Labour had lost to National by up to 30 seats. The Nats, if I recall, had a 30-seat majority in the House. There was a real level of disenchantment and people stayed at home. I think the voting might have dropped to about 60 or 70%, I can't remember offhand. But there was a real push on at that point too. There had been a referendum on electoral reform, and essentially it was seen as basically the way of reforming the system was through electoral reform, and the alliance was formed originally as a means of pushing all those parties who were opposed to the free market, and that was how the Democrats felt like it. That was why they were able to actually be part of the alliance, to actually bring us together to offer a cogent and comprehensive basically argument against the free market, and to have a cogent, coherent force against free market policies and parties, which National and Labour were both of. And so that happened in 1992. Electoral reform, of course, happened in 1993. The Alliance was one of those parties and so on that was foremost at pushing the change to MMP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another factor driving this period in the 1990s was the fact that, as I understand it, the 80s was a period of massive industrial unrest, the most or the highest period of strikes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to approach this more abstractly, what this reminds me of is that the alliance was nearly exactly 100 years after another alliance, that of the Liberal-Labour alliance, which itself followed a period of high industrial agitation, famously the 1890 maritime strike. This is an area that I'm fairly new to in my reading of history, but I figured since you teach history, you might be able to impart some historical knowledge, and whether you see some significance in that. Do you regard there being a certain continuity in the problem, we might say, of progressive reform, given that 1894 was the year, if I've got the year right, of the Industrial Conciliation and Arbitration Act of William Pepper Reeves, and that kind of rhymes in some way with what of the consequences of the fourth Labour government for the working class in New Zealand. Is that something that you can speak to? I know also you've delivered a public lecture on the Socialist Party from the Socialist Party of the early 20th century New Zealand.
Well, I mean, I never actually thought of referring it to the Liberal government and so on in the 1890s. I never actually drew that comparison, but yeah, you're quite right. But I mean, the alliance, as I said, was in reaction and so on to what was happening at that point in time. And there was a feeling that unless something was not done, that New Zealand will continue to have free market governments and so on of whatever hue moving forwards. And like I said too, in 1990, National was elected. They had a finance minister called Ruth Richardson. Ruth Richardson basically was an admirer of Roger Douglas. And despite the fact that National had gone to the polls promising a decent society and a slowdown in economic, and of course the free market and so on like that, they didn't. Ruth Richardson did two things. She delivered what was known as the mother of all budgets, which basically privatised even further, slashed wages, slashed benefits, did all these sorts of things on Treasury advice. And then they also implemented what was termed the Employment Contracts Act. Prior to this, in 1890 as well, the unions had actually had an award structure. Basically, awards had been negotiated nationally, and unions were recognised, protected by law. And in 1992, the National Party basically decided to get rid of all that. So essentially, union bargaining will be done on a free market basis, and everyone knows that unions are artificial creations and so on, and have no place in a free market. So they rewrote the law, or they rewrote the law to essentially ensure that contracts were between you and your bargaining agent. The bargaining agent was not the union. In fact, nowhere in that law was the word union mentioned. And so essentially at a stroke, they basically wrote out the union movement and so on. And so you had a lot of unions essentially that collapsed virtually overnight and so on as a result of that. Now, there was pushback from the union movement originally before that, and I'm not going to go into that except for the fact that to say that essentially that within the feeling within the unions even now is that essentially that there was a betrayal, one could say, by the union leadership or by the CTU leadership and so on, against the Employment Contracts Act, that essentially that workers wanted a general strike and the union leadership refused to actually have a general strike. And it was emerged later on when Jim Bolger, who was the Prime Minister at that time, actually admitted that if the unions had actually struck, then the government was prepared to back away from the Employment Contracts Act. So there was a feeling that the unions or the union leadership betrayed, basically the rank and file unionists and so on like that. But the result of that, the result of the mother of all budgets, and the result of the Employment Contracts Act essentially devastated working class New Zealanders. At a stroke, essentially people lost benefits, they lost basically a whole range of reforms and programs that they previously had, and they actually lost their rights and so on at work.
Mm-hmm. So now that we've established some of the more immediate motivations behind Alliance in the 1990s and perhaps some deeper historical resonances, we can perhaps address the present turn towards reforging the Alliance in context of where we currently sit, and that we've followed a decade of upheaval and the popularity around the world of social democratic movements. And the question that I suppose would be primary to us would be why now? What do you make of that?
Well, I think that essentially, for many years, of course, those of us who were active throughout the 1980s and 1990s in some sort of post-traumatic stress, and, basically I spent a lot of time and so on after that recovering from what had actually happened. And for the most part and so on, since 2000, to be honest, that there hadn't actually been essentially a need in one sense. Yes, neoliberalism still existed, yes, was in place, but was very much muddled and watered down. However, having said that, basically, there was not a desire within the Labour Party to actually go back to actually promoting a social democratic policy. And in fact, Jacinta Ardern, who's lauded on the international stage, her entire philosophy in the Labour Party was a Glenn Campbell song, which was basically, to try a little kindness. And that makes a good Glenn Campbell song. It's not necessarily a political philosophy, nor indeed a political program, but that was how the Labour Party saw it. It was more like fudging the edges and making sure that neoliberalism didn't go around biting people and so on like that. Now, the current government, of course, headed by National, is essentially an act-led government. And anyone who doesn't understand that, New Zealand, of course, under MMP has coalition governments, and usually the majority government, of course, directs the other two governments who are in power. This government has been unique in the sense that the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, is essentially and absolutely hopeless. And that's the only way to actually put it. He doesn't make a decision, and the result of it has been is that ACT essentially has basically managed to run the government and essentially put forward, or rather begin again where it was left off in 1992. So essentially it's flicked the switch, and basically New Zealand has moved back about 30 years, back to the days of privatisation, back to the days of benefit cuts, and of course back to the days, wonderfully, of soon to be outlawing labour reforms and again. And the need was...
Neither left nor right, but backwards.
Pardon? Neither
left nor right, but backwards.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But That's definitely right. But there was a felt that given the fact that the Labour Party still doesn't seem able to actually front up and do anything about it, that maybe that it was a good thing that the alliance was resurrected. The alliance still existed. It was dormant, it was inactive, but it had money, and we had, there were people like myself and so on who were nominally on the books. Tom Round and the Canterbury Socialist Society, or members within it, decided that they wanted to basically stand for Parliament. They recognised the fact that not Parliament, sorry, Council. They recognised the fact that the way to do that was probably to have a social democratic program and policy. And when Victor Bello and myself mentioned that basically we still had the alliance, they suddenly leaped upon it and basically reformed it, much to our amazement and amusement. And so that's where the alliance has come from. And essentially, we've been both quite surprised by it, because we have actually had people writing to us saying it's good as back, and applying to join. And in fact, there's not been any opposition and so on to it, aside from the Labour Party, who are now visibly upset in Christchurch that they have an alliance candidate to actually compete with. But like I said, there was a need. There was a need that people felt to actually progress social democratic policies and to promote a program that I think at this point is still very valid and just hasn't been heard from for the past 30 odd years.
Well, I want to leave enough time for audience questions, but I think the one that I'll conclude my part of the Q&A or the interchange with is addressing this kind of, humble new beginnings of alliance and how they might contrast with where Victorian Socialists are at in Australia, which has had some recent kind of electoral successes. And I know that Canterbury Socialist Society hosted Daniel Lopez to address Victorian Socialists a couple of years ago at their yearly conference. So the question that I'm interested in, considering that we're at the Platypus Oceania conference and people in the audience might be entertaining questions in their mind about whatever it means to be on the left in this part of the world, I wonder what you think of the prospects being for the left in this part of the world, particularly in and through the alliance, as opposed to other parts of the world where the social democratic projects seem to well and truly belong to the 2010s. What does it mean that this idea has persisted in Australia with Victorian Socialists and might have some prospects in New Zealand with the alliance?
You don't ask much, do you? Well, it's a difficult question to answer. Essentially, I believe that there still is value in the left, and I really don't think that the left is dead. Okay, I've never actually thought that. It's certainly tough, and certainly throughout my life, it's been made a lot tougher. And, when you read and so on the books and the pamphlets and so on about socialism in the early 20th century, there was a view and a vision that was essentially engaging and exciting. And I think to a large degree, the left has to re-engage and so on with that. We have to make ourselves relevant again with working people and with society and so on at large. And I think that the left forgot about that. I think that it became very formulaic, and I think that was the problem with Labour parties. So essentially we adopted Keynesianism, we basically raised wages and put in better conditions, all of which were good, but there was nothing more to it than that. And then essentially we just sat around and administered the system. We forgot about those things that originally motivated, socialists and left-wingers. And so I think that's about re-engaging with those ideas. And it's tough. I'm not going to lie, I'm nearly 58, and it can be, and it is tough. But you have to keep on going. The alternative is that you do nothing and things continue to degenerate, and they are. And if you don't believe me, you only have to look at New Zealand. Essentially, even though you might say, well, the Australian Labor government, the one thing is that, for example, before I came across there, I saw the other day the Australian Labor government had actually increased wages and benefits and stuff like that. At the same time, we are actually heavily reducing them. On the same day that you guys actually got wage rates and benefit rates improved, our government went ahead and reduced them. That's what can happen. And, so essentially it's all about, I think, essentially giving hope to people. And that's it. And this is where I get cascaded, obviously.
All right, can we turn over to audience questions? Do you want to, yeah.
So my question is kind of about, sorry, thank you. So my question's about kind of what you said about hope there. Sorry, I got notes. You mentioned in the 90s when Alliance emerged the first time, the unions sort of failed to respond to this attack on their rights from the shift from the award bargaining to this bargaining agent, I think was the term. And I think obviously there are parallels in Australia where we had a much stronger union system, and it got harmed by the Accords and then harmed further under work choices and Howard. But you clearly still believe in the unions. I do. I think a lot of the left, I know the left is apparently dead, but whatever the left is, believes in unions. We've just seen in Victoria a victory of a rank and file ticket. In the little biography, it mentioned that you work in the same sort of union because that victory was in the CPSU, the public sector union. You're an organizer there. I'm just curious, this hope that you have, I think a key task is preventing the union leadership from doing what you mentioned where they failed to stand up to that fight in 1992. I'm curious, you're organizing in that, what is, has the unions, have you at least sort of grappled with that? Have the unions grappled with how to ensure?
So your question is, have the unions actually dealt with what happened in 1992?
That, and also what sort of, given that you are still in them and they are a source of hope, what are some ways the unions in New Zealand and Alliance is engaging with them to sort of strengthen them should we come to that sort of turning point again where there is a chance for a strike that can actually...
No, the unions haven't really dealt with 1992. Okay, I speak as an active trade, as an employee of a trade union. And there are two ways. First of all, some unions just seek to ignore 1992. And if you raise, what did you do in 1992? Why didn't you strike? It's we don't want to talk about that. That's long time ago, blah, 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 blah. But unions have become far more conventional and so on. They really are a lot more timid than they used to actually be. And, unions now in New Zealand are mostly about, pushing wages, conditions and so on like that. We basically operate a service. And a lot of my job is about, essentially servicing members. They get into trouble, you get them out of trouble. Essentially you negotiate their contracts and so on for them. And there is basically, I'm not saying that the bigger unions have low resources and so on like that. They tend to actually engage more and so on and sort of society-wide sort of, we want to, change things. But overall, unions are in New Zealand, I think, a conservative beast. And that stems directly from what happened in the 1990s, because you have to remember that unions were completely destroyed in the aftermath of the 1992 reforms. And even the larger unions and so on like that suffered. For example, E2, which is a manufacturing union, basically it's formed from a number of other unions like the old engineers union, printers and so on like that, all of whom were forced to actually combine together. And so there's been that effect, I think, on unions. And with the latest reforms being pushed by ACT, by Brooke Van Valen, or as I call it, Brooke Van Vampire, who is essentially the Minister of Employment Relations, where again, they're actually seriously talking about removing, for example, sick rights, the right to personal grievances, all these different rights. Even though unions are basically saying, no, these are wrong, the actions against them have been mute, because unions at the same time, legislatively, we can't do much, we can't strike, unless there's bargaining going on. But the other thing too is the fact that essentially unions, I think, have become very afraid of what the outcomes could actually be.
I had a rather technical question, which if it's more Tom Rowd's area, that's absolutely fine, because I know that this is kind of his baby, as I understand it. But I had a question about the economic development program that Alliance put out, which I've been wanting to ask someone about since I first saw it. So it's overall a very Bill Such program. It's an import substitutionist developmentalist program for a larger industrial base, higher profits, higher wages, fewer shocks overall. And this is the idea that this is rooted in the idea that New Zealand is similar to an underdeveloped neo-colony with low value add primary industries that have prevented it from fully developing along normal capitalist lines. And this idea usually, especially historically, has supported the idea that we need to first fully develop New Zealand capitalism in alliance with the local capitalists against the foreign capitalists. And so you're right, if we want to retain our first world status, we have to reduce imports and develop secondary industry, public ownership of utilities and infrastructure. Legislation will provide higher wages and conditions. Low productivity will be solved by labour-saving technology, that is higher automation, and we will also end subsidies to uncompetitive employers who fail to adopt these measures. So, in short, higher wages, higher profits, higher capital intensity of industry, no subsidies. So I have two questions coming out of that. Would you agree that this is a program for a more peaceful and collaborative win-win relationship between workers and employers? And second, if higher wages, higher profits, higher employment, higher automation were all mutually compatible without massive subsidies to non-competitive industry, why hasn't that been put in place already? Because it would be clearly in everyone's interests. And the only reason I can think of is that everyone was really stupid and decided to do neoliberalism instead. Thank you.
Sorry, were you just asking what the program was? I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah. So the first part of the question was, would you agree that it's a program for class collaboration?
It's a social democratic program. I mean, essentially, all the Alliance is actually suggesting, of course, is in one sense return to a Keynesian economy. I mean, and that's essentially what you've read out and so on there. I mean,
not quite, because I mean, for example, Such's program relied on huge subsidies to non-competitive industry.
I know.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, there are as many versions of Keynesianism as there are, sort of fingers on my hands. But basically, it's a standard, I think, social democratic policy. I mean, at the moment, there's nothing being, nutted out in terms of actual what that might mean practically. You want to come and ask me in about a year's time, and hopefully we'll have a practical economic policy. But I mean, as overall philosophy and overall program, it's just a Keynesian restatement, I think, of what the Alliance actually believes in economically. I mean, I've got nothing more to, I can't give you any more details other than that.
I think that usually Keynesians are more honest about.
Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
I think usually Keynesians are more honest about what's possible under capitalism. That's all.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I've heard this one. I mean, look, I mean, there are people who believe that essentially that, you can only go so far in capitalism, and that's true. And there are people who believe that essentially, that it will stop you from doing any sort of social democratic program whatsoever. I don't buy into that. I've never bought into that. And essentially the history and so on of basically of the past 60 or 70 years prove that in fact, that you can actually do and actually achieve social democratic goals and policies and so on like that. So, I mean, that's a bit of a wider debate. But, essentially, I believe that in fact you can push boundaries, and we should be pushing boundaries. The alternative is, again, to do nothing. And I don't like doing nothing.
So just to clarify, in the 1991, there was a change from where New Zealand stopped compulsory arbitration. Is that correct?
What was that?
So in 1991, New Zealand, the government changed the union, how union deals were negotiated, and they went off compulsory arbitration. So in Australia, we still have compulsory arbitration, and it still kind of ended up with like being used to suppress unions as basically, well, if you're on the award, like what's the point of joining the union? So do you think there's any like insights you can provide in how whether compulsory arbitration is good or bad for unionism more broadly?
Well, I think that in terms of, there was, for example, in 1974, there was actually a push and so on at that point by the unions for actually have contracts. And the reason for that was because of the fact that at the time you had the full employment, and you had a government that was pushing full employment. And the opponents to that were actually the business community, who essentially saw that basically that if you had to put in contracts and so on under, say, this full employment, that in fact, you'd be screwed to the wall. So essentially they were very, very eager not to have that. But I think overall, essentially, I would actually go for a centralised wage bargaining system. And one of the reasons I say that is because of the fact that under capitalism, of course, there is, essentially a real push on to actually making sure that you have large numbers of people can act as unemployed, essentially, and use that and so on as basically undermining rights, conditions, and so on like that. And that's what employers have done. And the last time, for example, several years ago, we had what was known as the public service pay adjustment, which was a centralised actually bargaining under the Labor government at that point. They're being actually pushed by the CTU. And the result of it was that people actually got guaranteed rises from the centre. And so for once, probably in the first time in 30 years, every worker and so on in the state sector anyway actually got a guaranteed price rise, wage and salary rise and so on like that. So you knew what they were. And it also fed into the public sector, into the private sector as well. So I'd actually argue that I think I'd actually support a more centralised bargaining system.
Just to draw out or synthesise the general character of the previous two questions, or at least as I perceive them, it seems like there's perhaps an antinomy or opposition between, not to be petty, but, another world is possible and there is no alternative. Thinking of the history of industrial conciliation and arbitration, the Act in 1894, how much that contributed to a rise in union militancy in the early part of the 20th century, how its very limits provoked the necessity for those identifying with the radical left to recognise how it pointed beyond itself. That might be more of a comment than a question, but I suppose that might have some purchase on the prospects of building social democracy today. That is the question of means and ends, perhaps. Would you say that you identify in some way with you might not identify with you might not identify as a Marxist, and I'm not expecting you to or trying to take up an affirmative position, but I wonder what you make of the limits of social democracy and how far you think it goes before there is a necessity for a more radical left to step in? Or did you ever identify with that or fraternise with people who held such views?
You don't ask easy, I mean, there are 147 different definitions of socialism. Okay, I think around that. They all have the one thing in common is the belief in some that essentially of betterment for working people and that capital basically dictates the rights and so on of working people, and that working people need to take control. And, I support that. And I think that, essentially, social democracy in the post-war period has always been about, essentially, as I said, the welfare state, Keynesian economics, and essentially ensuring that the economy basically delivers up certain goods and so on that enable people to participate economically and so on in that. I believe that essentially they have to go beyond that, that there has to be, essentially a desire now to essentially put into a program means by which people have more control, both economically and politically and so on, over their environments, over their working environments and so on. Now, essentially some people will say, well, you need to eliminate capitalism to do that, and I can understand, basically the argument and so on behind that. Some people will argue that essentially you can do that within capitalism and so on too, and they look and so on, particularly at the Scandinavian states and so on like that as a means by which it can be achieved. I would, and I admit it too, because I term myself as a democratic socialist, or basically an extremely pissed off left-wing social democrat. I'd be more essentially enamored and so on of a left social democratic, because I think that, essentially that in terms of capitalism itself, that essentially, yes, there are certain things I think that, private enterprise can do, pie shops, for example, stuff like that. And it is a matter and so on, I think, of bringing that into the fold, but ensuring that, in fact, the social environment, the social economy outnumbered, or the cooperative economy actually is the dominant, as opposed to the private economy. But as to how it's going to be done,
I was going to ask a question on your thoughts on the failure of social democracy, but that's kind of already been answered by that one. So I'll just go to I'll start screaming out the sect line. I had a very brief read over the Alliance's program. And for me, one of the big questions that emerges is, while obviously you seek to manage capital rather than destroy it, there's no constitutional demand. There's no demands for the abolition of the monarchy, no demands for a renegotiation of Waitangi with Maori people. And my big question is, why is there no grappling with the constitutional questions that will objectively, which will and historically have stood in the way of even what we, for lack of a better term, left social democrats in their attempts to manage capital?
Well, because we love the king. I'm not saying why.
And
the reason is because of the fact that we just haven't got around to it. These are the sorts of things and so on that, basically that do require a debate and a discussion and so on within the party, and we just haven't got that yet. I'm a Republican. I believe and so on that, that we shouldn't have the king as the head of state. But we need to have that discussion and so on. And there are also in New Zealand too, there is the complicating factor and so on of the treaty. And that is that a number of Maori iwi actually see the Crown as a partner in those treaty negotiations. So it opens up a far wider debate than just saying, well, we get rid of the monarchy and so on like that. But I take your point.
Cool. Thank you. I was going to evoke Ains and Means, but it was very ably lanced. There we go. Thank you. So I'll ask a follow-up question instead about something that you painted out, which was the basis for the mass parties in New Zealand, Labour and National, shattering, and that the sort of positions that would come to be sort of established as left or right originating from within both, in the sense of Muldoon's defence of Keynesianism, or in terms of the sort of Ruth Richardson, right within National lining up with Roger Douglas, and with Roger Kerr's sort of position as just a pure technocrat. So the name of Alliance, as you kind of evoked it, would be to collect a series of seemingly discrete positions and into sort of a constellation in order to enact a kind of a political change in kind of a Leclerc and Mouffe sort of sense. Do you see that as being the role of the newly revived alliance to sort of collect a constellation of positions in order to drag the politics in the direction that you think?
I would hope so. I mean, as to whether or not, essentially if you can't get 5% to actually stand up for what I would term as traditional social democratic policies, then I think you're in real trouble. And, the fact is that in the past, in the 1980s and 90s, the alliance did achieve, essentially in some cases 32% and was a mass-based party. So one would be hoping and so on that, essentially that you could actually basically, essentially encourage people and so on to again support those sort of principles and policies and so on like that. I mean, I think it would be difficult. I think that people have turned off politics. And essentially, I think there's a belief and so on too that essentially that you can't really do anything and people will not engage. And the real problem will be engaging people. Yeah.
Hi. I just had a question. So when you were talking about the new Labour Party and then the Alliance and all that sort of stuff, it sounds like most of the constituents of the people that became those parties were disaffected people that were like sort of against the neoliberal turn, for lack of a better term. But did it have any broader buy-in from like a more radical left? Like, for example, VS, which we've mentioned, his primary constituency was the Cliffites or Socialist Alternative. Was there any sort of crossover between these groups and that, or not really? Just out of curiosity.
Sorry, what was that again?
So, like, the new Labour Party, this alliance, the new one, the old one, all that kind of stuff. What kind of broader left buy-in? Like, is there other socialist groupings that have joined it, or is it mostly like disaffected union members and bureaucrats? I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, that have come together. Like, what is its actual constituency? You say that it continues to poll high in various points, but the people that are actually in the party, say, do the door knocking, do all the actual stuff, like, what are they? Where are they from?
Do you know much about Victorian Socialists and who's like who comprises the groups they're part of, like Socialist Alternative, the Cliffite Trotskyists, and also
well, at the moment,
the comparison.
someone from the Contemporary Socialist Society and those of us who are in the Alliance and so on to begin with. I mean, when the Alliance was originally formed, it encompassed a number of different groups and so on like that, some of which weren't basically amazing cooperative or indeed proactive and so on what they actually sought to do. But I mean, I remember too that essentially the Alliance was a lot more, I think, essentially representative of the people and so on that it actually represented. So it was very much a working class and sort of lower middle class organisation. And one of the things that, that reminded me of this was when we had Tom Round's campaign launch the other day, essentially Tom and I had attended the Greens Blues night and so on the night before. And it was an extremely nice, well-mannered, but bourgeois event is the best way of actually putting it. Whereas, essentially the Alliance launch was very much more proletariat. So, I'll be hoping again, essentially that this is the case, that the Alliance again represents, those people it actually speaks out for, which would be, a proletariat organisation, or rather, an organisation of the workers and lower middle class. Certainly, that was what I picked up, and that was certainly what the case was 30 odd years ago. So.
Hi. I just have a relatively short-ish question. But when I was looking at the Alliance's website, it says that the Alliance Party believes in that all people should enjoy well-paid, high-quality work, free education, healthcare, a safe, sustainable environment, the right to make decisions about their lives and communities. So following on from that, I'm just wondering, do you think that there is much of a difference between the Alliance Party and the Green Party of New Zealand? And if not, why not? And does it matter if they're ultimately the same?
I was waiting for someone to ask that.
Thought so.
Yeah, I mean, people have said to me, Quentin, the Greens are doing these same things and, they're operating, wealth taxes and so on like that. We did it first. I mean, we basically were the ones who first advocated and so on, capital gains taxes, wealth taxes and so on like that. Plus, I think the emphasis too, with the Alliance and with, basically the new Labour Party, was giving ordinary people essentially the right to participate within the economy and so on as a whole. And I don't think that is actually within the Greens, sort of overall philosophy or indeed within their policies. And like I said, policy itself, and this is in response to my friend who asked that question up there about our economics, is still very much a movable feast. It's something we haven't looked at yet to actually work out what we're actually going to do. But certainly in the old NLP, and I have uncovered papers of stuff in my garage, essentially we, had things like, for example, workers' councils. We talked a lot about, the need for participation and so on by workers in the economy and within the wider society. And I'll be hoping and so on to bring those back into the centre point again of the Alliance economic policy and so on like that. So,
just one last question and then we'll wrap it up.
So we'll probably talk about more of this a bit more on the panel tonight. But so the left kind of had a bit of a resurgence, like Bernie Corbyn, Syriza, but Australia and New Zealand kind of missed out on that. We had a little bit with the Greens in 2022, but now that's in Australia at least. But now that seems to have fallen off. So how do you think about this sort of attempted resurgence of the New Zealand sort of electoral left in relation to other left-wing electoral projects that have just passed in the sort of 2010s era?
sorry, man. Look, my hearing is fucked. You're going to think about that again.
Oh, okay. So basically, we had Bernie and Corbyn. We kind of missed out on that sort of era down in Australia and New Zealand. So how do you think about your project in relation to sort of the events overseas that have just that era's just passed of the millennial left era?
Right. So how do you think overseas events are going to affect the situation in New Zealand?
Yeah, sort of. But yeah, basically.
Just maybe to rephrase that question, the question was the relation of the Bernie Sanders and the Corbyn style mass electoral campaigns in the Imperial Core.
Well, I mean, I was actually kind of bad by both Sanders and Corbyn and so on too. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't have their issues, but by and large, two old guys, the boomer generation, essentially managed to motivate, I think, a lot of younger people to actually support them. And they actually gave real voice, I think, to basically, what is really left-wing social democratic policies and programs. And I think that is one sense, was a real shot in the arm and so on for the left generally, that you could actually start talking about these things again. And not only did they start talking about them, but they were actually popular. And I mean, something like, if in fact the democratic establishment hadn't actually mobilised against Bernie Sanders, then he could very well have been the presidential nominee for the Democrats. And if the right wing of the Labour Party hadn't organised against Corbyn, it's quite possible that Jeremy Corbyn could have won in 2017. And, I mean, because Corbyn's, Labour Party actually got a larger percentage of the vote than any Labour Party since, I think, about 1964. So, in fact, they actually achieved things. So I think, looking at that, I like to think that we'd be building on that. I think that there's a lot that they have to actually say that we need to actually build on. But also, I think, too, like I said, I think it was a motivational thing for me to actually have, these sorts of policies being actually discussed and widely publicised and so on like that. So I think that there definitely is a market for these sorts of policies. People want to hear something that's different.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. We'll take a break for an hour and then be back for 4 p.m. on the dot when we host our What Was Neoliberalism panel. And Quentin can catch his breath for that. And we thank you very much for his time. And thank you.
Thank you.